This is Dave Klein, and this is the Simulate Cybersecurity Newscast. I wanted to spend this newscast talking about a rather serious situation in the Ukraine with the Russian aggression against them. And I want to break this into a few parts. I'm going to talk about Russia's past use of cyber espionage and attacks in reference to the Ukraine, in reference to other countries, which is critical. I want to then talk about the kind of sanctions the United States and its allies have put upon Russia. And then the third part is what is the potential for threat against the world of Russian cyber attacks if it escalates. And then finally, I want to talk about some of the things that the United States has looked at as far as offensive cybersecurity to protect. So let's get into it. The history of Russia and cyber attacks against the Ukraine go back to 2014. In 2014, as you know, they attacked Ukraine, and they started with a series of cyber attacks first when they invaded, and that was quite serious. Then in 2017, they took a ransomware attack called Petya and made something called NotPetya, and they attacked a number of critical infrastructure places in the Ukraine with it. And what was interesting was that attack went on to become WannaCry, which was then repurposed for ransomware. If you understand wiper attacks, what they are is they're very similar to ransomware. The idea is to infiltrate the infrastructure of your opponent in the same way you do with ransomware. The difference is you wipe the drives, you encrypt them with no decryption key. And you actually set up to prevent reverse engineering, to prevent even your tool set, if it's taken by someone else, to decrypt. And that's what we saw from 2014 to 2017 as well. Now, in the current attacks against the Ukraine, they're using one called Hermetic Wiper, which is a new data wiper malware that we saw being purposed in the Ukraine in attacks, along with DDoS attacks. So the idea is they're using wiper attacks on top of DDoS attacks. The wiper attacks are permanent damage. DDoS attacks are temporary damage kind of things. And this is what they're doing. And again, they have a long history of this. So before we get into the potential for these Russian wiper and DDoS attacks to occur elsewhere, let's talk about some of the precursors that make us concerned a little bit about this. So what's important is the world, and many Russian citizens as well, are very much against this attack on the Ukraine. And we've seen some really good world sanctions come into play. For one, the US and its allies have removed the Russian central bank from SWIFT. So what is SWIFT? This is important to understand. SWIFT is a centralized messaging and transaction communication network for banking globally. And by removing them from this network, right, it's basically the way that most international trade and bank-to-bank transactions occur. It's about 11,000 financial institutions, about 200 countries. By taking their central bank out of the system, you are hobbling them in their ability to control inflation, to do transactions. For the oligarchy in Russia, often who have a plan B plan, who have money in places around the world in case they have to leave Russia, and in ways that they buy goods internationally, you hobble them. You prevent the oligarchy as well as Russia in general from being able to do this. And it's already had effect on the ruble. The ruble is devalued intensely. This is a great way to stop them in this offensive. Again, it's going to hurt their economy, and it'll be interesting to see. Switzerland today also announced that they would stop themselves, and they're a neutral country, about 363 Russian oligarchs and 4 Russian companies from doing business in Switzerland. So the idea is they can't do it through the SWIFT network. They may go through Switzerland, but they've been blocked there as well. All right, so that's currently what we see is happening in trying to pressure Russia to leave the Ukraine. What else could happen? Well, Russia's #1 export by far is energy, natural gas, raw petroleum, as well as refined petroleum, gasoline. It provides Europe with about 40% on average of all its energy. For Germany, it's as high as 65%. For Latvia and Czech Republic, 100%. What about the US? Only 3% of our crude oil comes from Russia. However, 21% of our refined gas comes from Russia, which is the #1 as far as that's concerned. Canada's #2 at 17%. So the key is additional things we could do globally is to prevent Russian energy from being purchased elsewhere, and that would also hurt their economy. So the challenge is we need to do this to protect the Ukraine and stop this aggression. But the next part of this video, I want to talk about what could be some of the ramifications from a cybersecurity perspective globally, and what are ways to be vigilant. So let's get into it. So the first question a lot of people have is they ask, has this happened before? Has there been a situation where Russia has used DDoS and Wiper attacks against someone outside the Ukraine? And the answer is yes. Probably the most prominent one was during the Olympics in 2018 in Korea. So if you remember, Russia hosted the prior one, the Winter Olympics, and were criticized for a huge doping scandal. And the Olympic International Committee has banned Russia, to the current date, by the way, from attending the Olympics. So the first Olympics after Russia was in Korea. And during the opening ceremonies, Russia wiped every single machine in the Olympic network dead during the opening ceremonies. And they made it a false flag to make it to seem like it was North Korea. Well, everyone realized who really it was. And the positive here was South Korea had really planned for problems and had done a lot of incident response planning, offensive testing, all sorts of things. And when this happened, they were able to continue. They went to manual. They went to manual to everything. And they were able to continue and not have any disruption of the opening ceremonies. And 12 hours later, when the first game started, everything was restored. So it actually had a very nice happy ending to what it could have been. So yes, Russia has used this to their advantage in the past. So now let's go to the current situation. Let's say if these SWIFT banking and other types of things that begin to occur against Russia are successful. What are some of the things that they could try? They could absolutely try to use wiper file technology against critical infrastructure in any number of countries. And what's really important here is if you're an oil producer, you are a target, right? The concept is if we ban Russian oil and petroleum products, we're going to need to compensate for that. And so one thing they would do is attack critical infrastructure in all sorts of oil producing countries. Mexico, Middle East, Canada, United States, among others. On top of that, they may try to interrupt financial sector as well, among other things. So that's something we need to be vigilant about. So what are some of the positives here? And I know that sounds weird for me to say positives. A wiper attack is very similar to a ransomware attack. And what we found in 2021 was the ransomware has reached the boardroom level. And things are happening because of it. So the kind of incident response plans you do to protect you against ransomware are very similar to a wiper file. Again, we talked about wiper attack. Wiper attack, again, is like ransomware, but no decryption. So the kind of things you've done for ransomware will help you here as well. Really suggest that you get an incident response plan together, look at all your critical assets and make sure they're protected, and do offensive testing. One thing that is kind of really important is us as Simulate, the minute we found out about this new wiper technique, we came out with an offensive attack, the hermetic wiper attack. We came up with a safe, offensive way to test in your environment to make sure that your controls are configured appropriately to be successful. And again, part of those controls are not just your security controls and your first-party controls, your operating systems and instances and stuff, but also your incident response plans to make sure everyone is working at optimal level and things like that. So those are some things you could do, and let's hope that that works. Finally, having worked on President Obama's executive order to protect critical infrastructure, among other things, and other projects in federal U.S. government customers and private sector, I'm often asked, what other offensive things could the U.S. government do against Russia? And I want to start with a preemptive. I hope it doesn't come to that. To me, this is a time for saner heads to win and to de-escalate things. So, but people are like, well, what can the United States do if, God forbid, there's additional attacks that Russia does, and we need to protect ourselves? So, one thing that's kind of important is I've heard that President Biden was briefed on things that we could do. The key is a couple of things. The United States, from an offensive technology perspective, is really advanced. We could do a number of things. We could literally, because most of the internet infrastructure still runs through the United States, knock Russia offline from the internet. We could disrupt railroads to prevent additional resources being used against Ukraine. We could disrupt power and things like that. But God forbid it gets to that, because I think the biggest thing about the United States is we really don't want to do that, right? We want to disrupt, not destroy. And we don't want Russian citizens to be victims. And if you've seen the news, a lot of Russians aren't really for this war. And what we've learned in the past is sometimes being offensive, you get something that is worse. You lose the popular opinion in Russia, and you polarize them with a dictator. So the key is there are several things the United States could do, but let's hope it doesn't come to that.